Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining today's event, which is hosted by Saga's relatively newly formed. Oh, sorry, hang on one second, wrong screen that I'm sharing. Got multiple windows open here. Our members contribute to and give feedback on. Thank Seth Paul from our products team and a member of the Data Empowerment Committee for introducing us to his wife, Danielle, and allowing us to benefit from her expertise today. With a background in cognitive science, Danielle has nearly a decade of experience in UX research and product strategy. As a consultant for high-growth businesses, she specializes in establishing scalable research processes and data-informed roadmaps. She's the co-founder and research director of the UX Researchers Guild, which is a community of independent researchers and strategists available for hire on demand. Danielle is also a professor and director of the User Experience Master's Program in Applied Cognitive Psychology at Claremont Graduate University. Finally, she is the founder and leader of the Games and Interactive Technology Lab, which is a nonprofit UX research lab focusing on apps for supporting mental health, cognitive accessibility, educational technology, and employee experience. So we are super lucky to have Danielle with us today and grateful to her for joining us. So with that, Danielle, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Catherine, and Data Empowerment Committee team. I'm really happy to be here. Surveys are one of my favorite topics. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, are we on my slides then?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So to start off, I want to ask you all a question. Reflect deeply and think very carefully about this because it's kind of a tricky question to answer, I think. Have you ever taken a bad survey? Of course you have, right? Bad surveys are everywhere. So we've all taken a bad survey. We've all taken a difficult survey, a survey we didn't understand, a long survey, right? And today I'm hoping to share some tips with you for writing better surveys. Now, I couldn't talk about surveys without having you all take a survey. I know, who am I? So let's take a survey together. It's just 3 questions long, and I think it will help me to understand where everybody's coming from in terms of your experience. So on the next slide, there will be a QR code, so you can use your phone, or you can enter the code into slido.com on your browser. So the first question, to help me understand your experience, what's your approximate proficiency in survey design and analysis? All of the responses are anonymous, but they do come in live, so you'll see as folks answer. Great. I'll give you just another few seconds to get your answer in. Okay, this is looking pretty promising. So looks like we have a couple people in the 1, a couple people in the 5 category, and the vast majority of people 2s and 3s. 2s and 3s on proficiency, so right in the middle. Excellent. Very helpful for me to get a sense of your skill level. Another question that will help me understand the audience a little bit is this one. So moving on to the next question, how smart are you? This will be really helpful data for me today to understand my audience a little bit better. Can't give a presentation without knowing how smart the audience is. All right, it's looking pretty good. So majority of you feeling very to extremely smart, at least moderately smart. Wonderful, very valuable data for me to have here. The final question I want to ask you all is also really useful for me. How much do you think you'll love my presentation? All right, we're coming in strong with a lot. Somewhat is gaining traction. A couple holding out at not at all. Okay, thank you. So 2/3 of you feeling like you're going to love my presentation. Really good information for me to have starting things off. So some of you, being as smart as you are, maybe thinking to yourself that this survey was a little suspicious. And you'd be right about that. I wrote some suboptimal survey questions for you on purpose. And we're going to explore why these survey questions are suboptimal and what I could have done to make these better. Before we dive into that, though, I really want to share one piece of advice when it comes to thinking about surveys in general, which is that there is always room for improvement. I have been writing and using surveys very regularly for almost 15 years. And I can tell you, I have never come across a perfect survey. There is no such thing as a perfect survey. It's kind of like trying to find the perfect novel or the perfect piece of art, right? It's kind of subjective. It's all based on context. So I want you to have the mentality when you're writing your surveys, it's not about trying to shoot for perfection. It's just about writing effective surveys. And every survey could get better. We stop writing a survey not when it's perfect, but when we're done with it, right? When we can't look at it anymore and we can't find ways to improve it. So I want you to have that in the back of your mind, is that this is really just about improvements. There are definitely patterns that you can use to make better surveys in general, but overall, getting a lot of eyes on that survey and having a mindset of continuous improvement is how your surveys will end up being more effective over time. But let's point you down a path to potentially more success. So here are the topics I want to cover today. I don't have a ton of time with you. I could talk about this for many days, but we don't have time to dive into everything. So I'm just going to cover the basics of survey design, give you some tips, give you some resources, and I'm going to share these slides after the session for anybody who wants them, so you can reference things and follow a couple of links that I'm giving you. So let's first start off with the basic anatomy of a survey. And I mean, how many of you have ever left without finishing a survey? started walking through a survey and not finished it, right? Pretty common. And the two main reasons why are typically you got stuck on a question and then you bounced, or maybe that survey was too long. How many folks have seen like the progress bar of doom at the top, where you fill out 20 questions, click next, and then only a tiny, tiny piece of that progress bar fills in? It's a really disheartening feeling. So we don't want our surveys to be too long. So what's the ideal length, and what's the ideal order of questions here? So you're going to start off with an instruction page or paragraph of some kind. I like to tell people avoid full instruction pages if you can, because a lot of people won't read them, or they'll just bounce from that page if you don't have questions on that page. Keep instructions brief, keep instructions vague. We don't want to bias anyone by telling them that our jobs are on the line, or that we're trying to decide whether we want to sunset a product or take something off the market, right? So if people know what you're after, they'll respond differently, and we don't want to bias anybody's responses. So keep it vague. Say something like, we want to capture your experiences on X. The very first question, the goal there should be to get some engagement with your survey. With human thinking, we have this natural tendency to, as we start something, we want to finish it. So once we get going, it's easier to keep going. So we want them to engage with that very first question. Start with something unobtrusive, not very invasive in terms of what you're asking. Start with an easy question. And sometimes you can even start with an interesting question, something kind of provocative about their opinions on something that you think they're motivated to answer. Those are all good first questions. Next, I'd say ask your open-ended questions. Open-ended questions being the questions that provide you a text box where you're typing out your answer, as opposed to close-ended questions are things like multiple choice or select all that apply, pre-populated answers for you. So you want to put in any open-ended questions, if you have any, toward the beginning of the survey. And the reason is because it takes a lot of time and mental energy to fill out those questions. So we want to give them those questions while they're nice and fresh. The next thing to think about in terms of question order is that order matters. So if you think you're going to have everybody say like what they don't like about the product, tell us everything you don't like about the experience. Tell us everything you didn't like about the hotel. And then you have them rate the hotel. Well, they might have all of the bad things top of mind. So the order does matter. You can get around this by asking questions that are based on memory first, and then questions that are based on recognizing something. So what I mean by that is, if I ask you to recall as many chocolate brands as you can from memory right now. Got a couple of chocolate brands in your mind. Then if I gave you a list of chocolate brands, Hershey's, Cadbury, I'm going to quiz myself now, Dove, Ghirardelli. If I give you a list of chocolate brands and ask you to tell me which of the following you recognize, you're going to select a whole bunch more than what you were able to recall from memory. So we just want to make sure that whatever would sort of bring up those memories, if you need to capture what's top of mind, isolate the questions. When it comes to your last questions, I always put a comment box at the bottom. Anything else you want to share with us? Any other comments? People will tell you about your survey. They'll tell you things that you didn't know you wanted to know. They'll explain their answers, and that's really helpful. The other thing about order is that we want to put our demographic questions at the end. Demographic questions are things like age, marital status, household income. All of those questions tend to be kind of obtrusive, kind of difficult for people to answer, and they can bias responses. So we put them at the end. And finally, thank the people for participating and tell them what the purpose of the survey was or if there's any next steps. So that's the time at the end to really give them a breakdown of what you're going to do with the survey responses. I really want you to think about, as each participant is arriving on your survey, that they have like an energy meter or a health bar, kind of like in a video game. And as they're progressing through the survey, each type of question takes a certain amount of mental energy. And we are trying to keep their mental energy as high as we can throughout the survey. Open-ended questions cost more mental energy. Emotional questions, questions where I'm recalling something from a long time ago. These all cost more mental energy. So be aware of that. In terms of survey length, it's not what you want to hear. If it's too short, it's just right. So most surveys really should be less than 5 minutes long. That's about 10 survey questions or 10 survey items, with 1 or 2 of them being open-ended or like free response. It's okay if you have highly motivated participants to kind of step into the 5 to 10 minute survey range once in a while. But they really do need to be motivated to take a 10-minute survey. So don't expect a really high response rate on something like that. And finally, greater than 10 minutes, just don't do it. Don't do it if you can help not doing it. Greater than 20 items, more than 5 open-ended responses, you are just asking for poor survey response results. And also a lot of people to be incomplete in terms of survey responses. So unless you're incentivizing them, so giving them some kind of money or prize or something, you really don't want to go above a 10-minute survey. I gave you a little cheat sheet down here of a close-ended question takes 10 to 30 seconds to answer, open-ended. If you want multiple sentences from somebody, could take up to 2 minutes. So that can help you with the length of time. The next bit here is, what should you include in your survey at all? And what should you leave behind? So remember my how smart are you question? Oh, that was cringy even to ask you. So smart is a really difficult thing to measure, right? And it's a really tricky thing to ask someone, especially via a survey. We call these big nebulous things like smart. We call those constructs. You can't look at a person and say smart, not smart. Just like quality of life or health or love. These are constructs. They're really difficult to measure. And usually when we want to measure them, we measure them using a lot of different techniques. So with SMART, we might want to look at one of 3 different categories. So is it attitudes about how smart I think I am? My confidence in my abilities? Is it behavioral, like how many books I read last year? Or is it something like a characteristic? We call these demographics. So do I belong to a certain category of people? I'm an iPhone user versus an Android user. Don't think about how that maps to SMART, but things that are really easily observable or verifiable. The trick with surveys is that they're really good at measuring attitudes. They're not very good at measuring behaviors, and they're okay at measuring characteristics. So behaviors, self-reported behaviors, are always going to be a little bit squishy. One thing that I do with my graduate students is first day of survey class, I have them estimate how many minutes you spent on your favorite social media app yesterday. Think about how many minutes did you spend on your favorite social media app? And I have them write it down. And then I have them all pull out their phones and go to their screen time section and look at how many minutes they spent on that app. And they are always orders of magnitude off. So if they said 10 minutes, sometimes it's like 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 50 minutes. We're not very good at remembering our behaviors. We're good about remembering whether we did something, but we're not very good about remembering how often or what it was or what exactly we felt while we were doing it. So keep that in mind when it comes to surveys. So let's go back to SMART. We might want to just measure how smart I feel. That's an attitude related to SMART. We might want to measure how much do I think from strongly disagree to strongly agree, my friends describe me as smart. My friends describe me as creative, all of these other pieces of SMART. So we might ask those questions. And those are attitude-based questions, which surveys are really good at. When it comes to what to include in your survey, I really encourage you, 1 or 2 constructs. Don't try to measure everything in the world. Separate them into different surveys. So really think, what is the big question I'm trying to answer? What is that main construct? And maybe there's a related construct you can also bring in. But minimize the number of constructs you're trying to measure with your survey. Okay, so how do we write good survey questions? Closed question formats, close-ended questions, come in a variety of formats. These are the most common. So everybody knows multiple choice. What you might not know, but you totally know, is that when you see a series of squares, you actually intuit that you can select multiple if they are squares. If they're circles, you tend to know that if you select one and then select another, it's going to pop over to the one that you just selected. You're not going to be able to select multiple. So keep that in mind a little bit when you're putting together surveys. Do you want multiple answers? Select all that apply, or do you want just one answer? Select the answer that best fits. Rating scales are another one that's really common. So we're all really familiar with this question. How likely are you to recommend this to a friend or colleague? It's called Net Promoter Score, and you rate on a scale of 1 to 10. You might also be thinking about things like giving a star rating to a product or a service, or reviewing a movie, right? Out of 5 stars, you select. There's also a type of question called a Likert scale question. This is a Likert scale. These are standardized scales that have been used over and over and over again and have a lot of research behind them in the psych community. So we know that people answer these really reliably. And the most common one that you're all probably familiar with is strongly disagree to strongly agree. Likert scales, they come in 5 points or sometimes 7 points. Occasionally, you'll even see 10-point Likert scales. And we'll talk about how many points to use on a scale in just a couple of slides. I also want you to be familiar with a couple of other things. A matrix is a set of questions that all have the same answer scale. And these are awesome because you train your respondent on what the scale is one time, and then they're able to answer a whole bunch of questions. You need to be really careful when you switch from one type of scale to another, because how many times have you been going along, or maybe you don't even realize it, but you're going along and you're selecting your answers to each thing, and then all of a sudden it's a different scale. We're not saying satisfied to dissatisfied. Now we're saying agree to disagree, and it kind of trips you up. So we want to avoid that as much as possible by keeping these really consistent if we can. Sometimes you have participants rank things. I don't typically do this. I typically have people rate things, and then I rank them by their rating. if you followed that. So, but sometimes you can have participants rank things, what's the top, what's the second. And finally, there's this term called semantic differential. This is where we put two opposite words on either end of the response scale. Strong versus weak, active versus passive, cheerful versus uncheerful. Two opposite words. And these are a really common pattern to use as well. I've included some standard scales for you. So these are some standardized 5-point Likert scales. Use these whenever you can, because these have been tried and tested with a lot of people across cultures and tend to give really predictable results, really valid results. So when in doubt, look up the standardized scale. Frequency, agreement, importance, all of these things. I also have a little checklist here that we can look at. So this is my checklist for writing a good survey item. On the one hand, I have basic points. On the other hand, I have more advanced things. So on the basic side, we want to make sure that we're looking at a single topic per question, that the language is really simple, that we're selecting the best scale or answer options for that question, that there's not a lot of conceptual overlap between questions. You've all taken a survey before that was like, how satisfied are you with this experience? How happy were you with the experience? How would you rate your experience? These are all very similar conceptually. When we come across these things, we tend to just answer the same way if we've already seen a question kind of like it before. So you want to reduce the conceptual overlap between questions. And then, like I was saying before, consistent question formats. So that matrix, for example, we want to keep those answer options really consistent so that people can easily get through a lot of questions with really low mental effort, really low hit to that energy bar. So you may recall this question at the beginning. What's your approximate proficiency in survey design and analysis? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's a few things going on with this, but it violates a lot of these basic points. The first one, double-barreled questions. So this is more than one question hidden in a single survey item. I asked you, what's your proficiency in survey design and analysis? These are two different things. I don't know if anyone kind of felt that, but yeah, I can write a survey, but I don't know how I feel about analyzing a survey. So we'd want to break that up into two separate questions. This also violates simple language. Your approximate proficiency. Rather than saying that, we could lose approximate altogether. And then proficiency, why don't we just say something like skill level or some more common word? We want to avoid uncommon words as much as possible. Finally, the answer options were not ideal. Some people may have thought 1 was good. Some people may have thought 5 was good. Because they don't have any labels and it's not very systematic, our answers may have been all over the place. So just some ways we could improve this question. The other question that I asked, how much do you think you will love my presentation? Not at all, somewhat, a lot. A few things going on here. So in the advanced checklist, I have be careful with the words you and the words our. How much do you like our product? We want to make sure we're saying the product, not our product, not our company, because people have a tendency to respond more positively when they start thinking about people as opposed to things like experiences or products or services. So we want to make sure that it's just the product. And I said my presentation to try to get you all to say a lot. This one doesn't violate this second point. Watch out for ever, always, and never. Would you ever eat a slug? Well, sure, ever. I mean, I can think of some contexts where I would eat a slug. So you want to make sure that you're careful with these words that make people think twice about what you're really asking. And finally, positive or negative language. So how much do you think you will love my presentation? Does not at all love mean dislike? We didn't really ask about that side of emotions. I'm only asking about positive emotions here, which is going to give me the data that I want to hear, I guess. So we want to make sure we keep our questions really neutral. How did you feel about my presentation? How did you feel about the presentation? That sort of thing. So how many choices? How many items? 5-point versus 7-point scales? Honestly, most of the time, go for fewer. 5 is the standard that I tend to use. So 7-point scales are more sensitive to changes, but usually that sensitivity doesn't matter a whole lot. So if you're not going to behave differently based on a 5 or a 6, if you're not going to take a different action if someone says a 5 versus a 6, you probably don't need a 7-point scale. You don't need that level of sensitivity. And one example that comes to my mind is like pass-fail grades versus A, B, C, D, E, F grades. So if I wanted to look at the average grade, what were the effects of COVID on the average grades in math at this school? Well, I might find that if it's a pass-fail class, maybe it looks pretty much the same pre-post COVID. But if I look at A, B, C, D, etc. grades, I might see that fewer students are getting A's. So that's a more sensitive scale. So sometimes you may want to use that. Always give them a way to answer the question. So neutrals are good, but include something like it doesn't apply to me or I don't know, if that makes sense. One tip for open-ended questions where people are just responding free-form text, make sure your open-ended questions are a single topic. This is the most common problem that I see in open-ended questions is because they're going to type a lot for us, we assume that we can type a lot at them. So what's your first reaction to the new logo design? And what do you like and not like about it? Those are actually 3 different questions you're asking me. So break that up into 3 different questions. A few thoughts on survey sampling. So who should get your survey? How many responses is enough? When it comes to surveys, we're trying to get a representative sample. That's the goal. So it's better to survey. If I'm selling water skis, it's better for me to survey 5 water skiers than to survey 1,000 people who have no interest in water skiing. So you want to make sure that first and foremost, your sample or your group of responses that you're getting is representative of the people you're trying to represent in the first place. Greater sample size is good because it tends to be more representative of the people. You're more likely to find those edge cases or like those uncommon perspectives if you get a larger sample. But take it with a grain of salt. In surveys, we all tend to respond to surveys if we had a really great experience or a really bad experience. So you tend to lose a lot of people who are neutral. Just think about like Amazon reviews. You go on Amazon, you see a product, there's usually a ton in the 5-star and a ton of reviews in the 1-star and very few in the middle, because that's kind of how surveys work. I included this here as a reference, but this is just kind of a sample size guideline for you. If you want a lot of accuracy, so precision, then based on how many people are in your total population, your total pie of all the people you could possibly talk to or who could possibly fill out your survey, of all of those people, you want to survey this many approximately. So I give you kind of like more accurate and less accurate. So if we had 100 employees, you'll notice if I sent out like, who wants this cool t-shirt for Employee Appreciation Day? And we had 100 employees, I'd actually want to survey I want to get at least 80 responses back if I want to be really accurate. And maybe 45 to 50 if I want to be less accurate, but still pretty confident. You'll notice that the larger the group, the fewer responses you need proportionally to get a good, accurate reading. So something to be aware of. If you have a finite user base, like the employee thing, and you need to survey them regularly, consider a rotating sample or a random sample. So don't send every survey to all people every time. Instead, grab just 50% and send the survey to that randomly selected 50%. That way you're protecting people from getting too many surveys all in the same span of time. Final tips from me, just some things I've picked up over the years to inform your survey design. Number 1, generate 5 different ways to write every survey item. Use a friend, use a colleague, use a chatbot, but generate a whole bunch of different ways to ask the same question. You'll get better questions that way. The next one is to simplify. If you simplify your language, it usually solves all the other problems. So if someone paid you $1 million, could you make that survey question shorter, simpler? Could you substitute even simpler words? That's always a really good rule of thumb. Prioritize. Make sure you know what your most important question is. Cut as much as you can. Focus on the highest priority questions and then move out from there. The next one is to review. So read the question out loud to yourself or to someone else and see if it makes sense. Read the question and the answer and see if those two things match up together. The next one is just to test. Test with anybody. Ask a few people to take the survey, even if they don't fit the people you're trying to survey. And just have them give you feedback on how the wording is and whether it made sense. This has saved me so many times. Finally, make sure you decide what actions you're going to take based on the survey before you run it. So if you're going to improve the feature, if greater than 20% of people like the feature, but if it's less than 20% of people, you're not going to improve the feature. Write that down. Write down what that threshold is before you collect the data so you know where those lines are for yourself and for your team. So decide what actions you're going to take. It helps you prioritize your questions and it helps you realize which questions you don't actually need a response to. Final thought, work backward from the data you want. Imagine the day you give the report to the team, to your boss, to whoever it is. Imagine what you want to be able to say. 99% of our users are satisfied with feature X. Once you have that, it's really easy to write the question that will give you that information. So overall, how satisfied are you with feature X? And then we would just take the people who were satisfied. So working backwards is a great way to design your questions in a way that's going to meet your needs. And remember to enjoy the process, enjoy the experience. Survey writing is always a journey, and you can always get better and better. Collaborate as much as you can. It's fun. It's fun to measure how people think and try to get feedback on what different people are going to say. So enjoy. And then I've included some links on this last slide. So here are some helpful links for those of you who are writing a lot of surveys and my contact information if you need me. Great.
All right. Yes, you're saying a lot of appreciation there. Danielle, thank you so, so much. You will share the slide deck with us, I guess, and we'll get it out
Yes.
to the team so that everyone can access your contact information and the great slides that you put together for us. We do have a little bit of time left, so we'd love to open it up for questions.
Yeah, that would be great. Bianca.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks for coming out and doing this. It was really great. Apologies, I'm off camera. I'm walking on my treadmill, so trying to take advantage of that.
No worries.
I was wondering if you had any recommendations or thoughts around frequency. So like how in really thinking, especially for the team that I'm on at Saga, a lot of what we want to gather is how well is the tutoring program going? So that means trying to ask that throughout the year. So I don't know, just thinking thoughts of like, how often are you asking people the same question? Is there any strategy behind that?
Yeah, great question. And I hate to give you the it depends answer. That's the answer in a nutshell, but breaking that down a little bit. Some of the things that I think about when it comes to frequency is well, how big's my population of people? So if I have a lot of users and I can do that rotating random sample and protect people from getting too many surveys, then that's really helpful, right? Because then I can survey more frequently and get a pulse on those signals that you're trying to watch over time a little bit more frequently. And by frequently, I would say like, it probably doesn't change much over month. I mean, if big changes aren't happening very regularly, maybe you could get away with quarterly or every 2 months or something, getting a read on that. The other thing I'll say on it is how fast can your team take action? So if it's like, well, we can only inform the quarterly roadmap, then you might protect your users from survey fatigue by only gathering that data less frequently. Does that make sense?
Yes. Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question, Danielle. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
No, you can go.
Oh, thanks. So thinking about the semantic differential scale, can you talk a little bit about like when you should be using like opposite words versus like a survey that we recently sent out was extremely satisfied on one end and then the absence of that, so not at all satisfied. So should that have been extremely satisfied versus extremely unsatisfied or not at all satisfied?
Yeah, what a great, like, thoughtful question. I have the opinion, just from the surveys that I've seen over time, surveys tend to only capture positive and then the absence of positive. That's the tendency of surveys, just based on like how they're written and practices that have been really well established, I suppose. So I always err on the side of like, get that negative, especially if that negative is meaningful. Sometimes just the absence of something, it doesn't matter how much it's absent. If it's absent, we're going to take the same action, right? But overall, I really love semantic differentials. I really love like happy face, frowny face, conceptually. Maybe don't do that in practice, but those two opposite words give you the whole breadth of the spectrum.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, what a good question.
So would you mind opining about the Net Promoter Score?
I would love someone to commiserate with about NPS. Yeah, so okay, what I'll say, NPS, Net Promoter Score, is the question, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend or a colleague? And it is useful sometimes, and most often it's not very useful. And I'll give you an example. So let's say that our net promoter score, it's on a scale of -100 to +100. So that's the scale, take it or leave it. But the idea is you get this score somewhere along that scale. And maybe in quarter one, we get a score of 55. And then in quarter two, we get a score of 56. And it's like, okay, did we improve? We don't really know. But let's say the following quarter, we get a score of 50. What the business or organization always wants to know is why? Why did it go down? What's going to happen? What should we do? And because of that, NPS, Net Promoter Score, operates on this high level, like bird's eye view. So when you go from 55 to 50, you just know that maybe something dropped, but you don't know of all the different pieces that could contribute to that, what caused the drop. So that's a challenge, and why it's often called a vanity metric, because it's a score that lots of people watch, but can't really take a lot of action on. And my only argument against myself right now is that NPS is really useful because everybody uses it. So you can compare, like, what's my Net Promoter Score as a business to a competitor's Net Promoter Score as a business. So the comparative is useful. But overall, it's not very sensitive metric, not very actionable metric. Thanks for bringing it up. David.
I have what's kind of like maybe a basic question, but when would you not want to do a survey?
Ooh, I like that question. Well, so surveys are good at measuring attitudes, like I was saying. They're not super great at behaviors, but sometimes that's all we have. Like if we have a digital experience and we don't have data about what's actually behaviorally happening, then sometimes surveys can be a good proxy for behaviors. So in that case, for example, like if we had a bunch of analytics around who's clicking on what, don't run a survey. You don't need to ask them. You don't need to waste your mental energy bars of all your respondents. But attitudes, it's a pretty good one. Sometimes also, maybe this is a little bit too nuanced, but I like to talk in terms of, is it important that it's present for people, or is it important that it is prevalent? So if I have 100 people and one of them is having a heart attack, my off-the-cuff examples always get really weird. One of them's having a heart attack. I really care. We have to take action. It's present. It matters that it's present. If I have 100 people and 5 of them are mildly hungry, well, 5% mildly hungry, maybe if 50% were mildly hungry, we'd feed the group. So sometimes surveys are good at giving you exactly how many. Is it 5%? Is it 60%? But they're not very good at explaining like what each person is feeling when they're feeling hungry. So you might want to do something like have a conversation, do like something more in depth rather than a survey.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Danielle, I've got a question about providing a neutral option. So that was something that you suggested to give respondents something that they can reply with. I've also read opinions that it's best to not give a neutral option because it's kind of an opt-out, right? Like, I don't know, I'm just going to pick the middle option. And that removing it pushes respondents to choose a positive or a negative. How would you respond to that?
I mean, all of that is absolutely true. Early in my career, I was so anti-neutral because what I saw was the organization that I worked for, they didn't know what action to take when so many people were in neutral. So is neutral bad? And what I found oftentimes is that the organization would treat neutral as bad. If they're not positive, then it's bad. So I stopped using neutral in all of my surveys. I did 4-point scales in all of my surveys. And there's some pros and cons to that. One problem is that if you have a finicky user base and especially if your topic is sensitive, so emotionally sensitive or something that has some stigma around it, you want people to stay in the survey and not bounce. And sometimes people will get stuck if you give them positive and negative choices only, to the point where they'll bounce. Like, I'm neither positive nor negative, therefore I bounce. So you have to weigh that of, well, is neutral meaningful? A lot of people will pick neutral if the real answer is I don't know. So sometimes providing an I don't know will actually put people in the right category. But there's a time to use neutral. And if neutral is meaningful as well, like if we take a different action if they were neutral as opposed to negative, then I would say include neutral. But yeah, my thoughts and feelings on that topic have sort of evolved over time and based on the context. Super great questions. I apologize too. Like, you may have noticed that my eyes are watering. I talk a lot for a living, and sometimes I just get the frog in my throat. Maybe you didn't notice, and I've just outed myself.
Well, if anyone has questions in these last few minutes, certainly share. But in the meantime, I will put a link in the chat to a survey that it's possible I have been tweaking throughout this presentation based on what you've shared, Danielle. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. So here is a survey. Link in the chat. We would love for all of our respondents, all of our audience today to complete it. Let us know what you thought of today's event. There's also a space where you can suggest future data development events that you think would be valuable to the FACA community. So take a moment and complete this survey and try not to be too judgmental of the survey design. But again, if there are any last questions, feel free to ask while we have Danielle here with us.